Hey there, I'm Sarah A. Chrisman,
I'm Gabriel Chrisman.
and today we're going to talk to you about Horatio Alger's book, Luke Walton.
And Horatio Alger in general.
And Horatio Alger in general. So, Horatio Alger is, he was rather well known in the 19th century. He's less well known now.
He was extremely popular around the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was definitely an influence on me when I was writing Ken and Felix for my books. Felix used to have a frame, but some little four-footed friend I know knocked his picture down and broke the glass in the frame, but we won't point fingers.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, when I was writing the characters of Ken and Felix, Horatio Alger's work was the seed, I would say, of that. Horatio Alger boys, and he tends to write boy characters, they're these inherently good characters. And
perhaps excruciatingly good.
Sometimes they're excruciatingly good. That's the fault I do find with Horatio Alger's work in general, is sometimes his boys are a little too good, in the sense that when another boy would, turn his head to cough, the boys in Horatio Alger, you get the impression they're occasionally turning their heads to polish their halos. They're like Sunday school tract boys. They're a little too good to be believable. Like there's a bit in here where he's just rescued a woman from getting run over by a streetcar, and
as people do.
Yes, people do. And he's just saved her life, and so then after saving her life, he takes off his cap and says, "I apologize for grabbing you that way. I'm so sorry." After he's saved her life from getting run over by the streetcar. Yeah, and so
still, his characters provided the seed, because they really do. Horatio Alger was very good at depicting friendships between two boys.
Yes, he's very good at depicting these chummy friendships, which is definitely part of the model for Ken and Felix in my books. And some of the other models for that, if you've noticed Felix's name, his name is Felix Halloway. We've got Will Halloway from Something Wicked This Way Comes. And when Ray Bradbury was writing this, I think he may have had a little bit of Horatio Alger's boys in mind when he wrote this, but he wrote his boys a little more realistically, and
he tried to show the two sides of the coin. He has one boy who's really truly good,
right,
and one boy who might not be.
Right. And so a big part of the story in Something Wicked This Way Comes is the character arc of Jim Nightshade as the foil to Will Halloway. But he was another influence on me, and I love him because think of this as his rebuttal to Horatio Alger's boys who are just a little too good. And Will, why, he's the last peach, high on a summer tree. Some boys walk by and you cry seeing them. They feel good, they look good, they are good. Oh, they're not above peeing off a bridge or stealing an occasional dime store pencil sharpener. It's not that. It's just, seeing them pass. That's how they'll be all their life. And so it's a much more realistic view of a boy, but he's still a good boy, and that's what matters. I dislike the tendency in a lot of modern fiction to have all characters who are just totally evil all the time.
Yes. There is a trend for the despicable hero.
Yeah.
And that is I don't know, a pretty bad trend.
And it's different from an anti-hero.
Yes.
Because an anti-hero like Holden Caulfield, I know you don't like Catcher in the Rye.
I hate the Catcher in the Rye.
I like Catcher in the Rye. But Holden Caulfield... Okay, who is your favorite anti-hero if you don't want to hear me defending Holden Caulfield?
No, you go ahead. Defend Holden Caulfield.
As you look disgusted. I just find Holden Caulfield more believable than the Horatio Alger boys.
Oh, he's believable.
He's very believable.
He's just not a very, admirable character in any way, shape, or form.
Okay, how about Huck Finn? Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer.
Yes, those are both admirable characters.
They're both admirable characters. And they're closer to contemporary with Horatio Alger.
Definitely.
And Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn, they're not necessarily boys you want for neighbors.
Right.
Because they get into mischief. They do all sorts of things that their parents wouldn't approve of, and we know neither of them have parents, but certainly Tom's aunt doesn't approve of them.
Right.
Well, Huck has a father, but that's another thing. Anyhow, they're more believable than a lot of Horatio Alger's boys, even if you wouldn't necessarily want them as neighbors. They're more fun to read about because they are more plausible. But that said, I do think it is important to have some characters who we can relate to, but they do choose the good. I do believe in that. Who was it who said that if you know the good, you must choose the good? Was that Aristotle?
No, that's Plato.
That's Plato. Okay, yeah. If you know the good, you must choose the good. And Horatio Alger boys definitely are always choosing the good.
Yes.
They're always choosing the good.
The idea was to have characters that you could look up to, that you could try to model yourself on, even if you never achieved that level of perfection.
Right. No one achieves the level of perfection of Horatio Alger.
Of course not. It would be impossible.
It would be impossible. There are passages in here where his characters are very black and white. They're very binary. They're very one way or the other. He has the mustache-twirling villains, and then he has these pure boys. And nary the twain shall meet, basically. There's very little gray in his books, which is...
it was the intention.
It's the intention.
It was
because
definitely how they were designed.
He's writing characters that are models to base oneself on, models to aspire to. And he was very good at it. He was very good at it. Parents loved his books because his boys were so pure and pure of heart.
Right.
They never even think of doing any sort of mischief, ever.
But they haven't aged well. Basically, modern society has not been kind to Horatio Alger.
Which is unfortunate. Because there was a lot of blowback, there was a lot of argument that these are implausible characters you can't connect with. I do think they still have an important role especially in children's books. Especially in children's books. I think that it's important for young people to have these characters they can look up to and try to be like, try to emulate. I do, though, like the ones who have a little more complexity to them. And so, like I said, the Horatio Alger characters were the seed for Felix, and especially I chose Luke Walton today because this is the story of a newspaper boy. And so that was the one I went to first when I was writing Felix as a newspaper guy. Felix, my idea with Felix was basically he was a Horatio Alger boy who grew up. And besides that, there's also the influence of a lot of the cycling magazines that we read from the period. That's why Gabriel's got Outing over there, because the stories in there, they are full of these very chummy friendships.
A lot of them were the epitome of the sort of 19th century club friendship.
Right.
And those clubs, those social clubs that were also involved in sport or a variety of other things, were the place where you found these, male-male friendships that were, lifelong and, much deeper than you find a good deal of modern friendships of the same type.
We're going off on a tangent
here.
Let's get back to Horatio Alger.
Horatio Alger, yes.
So, he, again, is known for these young man who made his own fortune stories, and a lot of them go that way. Luke Walton goes that way, Paddle Your Own Canoe goes that way, which is another of his books. When I read them the first time, that was the thing that stuck strongest in my mind. When I recently went back and reread a lot of them, I realized they are a young man making his own way in the world stories. They are, and yet they seldom start from abject poverty. There's usually something where they were well off to begin with, then their family lost their fortune, and they wind up in abject poverty, and then they have to work their way back. But these are it's the deposed prince model.
It's the sort of Campbellian model, instead of the truly American model of truly someone from nothing pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps. But that is what they're remembered as.
Right.
But when they're closely examined, you find that older Campbellian mythology that's in there about someone who, fell and then has gotten themselves back up into position.
Right, the redemption stories.
It's a redemption story, yes.
Whereas as an American, personally, I prefer the up from nothing
yes.
story. I really do. I prefer the, truly making your own way, as opposed to just getting back something your parents lost.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why I wrote Felix the way I did. And I think that speaks to people more, because I think that is a more realistic story. There are not necessarily that many people who start out rich and then lose everything and then work their way back up to being rich.
Right, though people often over-focus on them.
People do over-focus on them, but I do think it is possible to better yourself in life.
Absolutely, yes. And that is the true sort of American arc to stories.
Right. I think that part of why he wrote the stories he did was he was writing to a market. Mm-hmm. And I think that the middle-class parents who were buying these books for their children liked to hope that if something happened to them and their children suddenly were flung into abject poverty, that they would rise all the same.
Yes.
And I think he was writing it as much to please his market as for anything else, mm-hmm. which is an interesting step back to look at it from a writer's perspective.
The commercial writer's perspective.
Yeah.
And he was a commercial writer.
Oh, he was very much a commercial writer.
He churned these out by the dozen.
Yeah. Yes. Churn.
Yes.
But he was writing for a living, and you kind of have to do that.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
But anyhow, I think in sum that these are good books. They're definitely part of the American canon. They're definitely part of the books that built our country. And as such, I think that people should still be reading them. If you get a little too over... don't go into a diabetic coma from all the over-saccharine sweetness of them. Mm-hmm. If you need a little leavening from that, you can read Ray Bradbury, or you can read the outing stories, the short serials that appeared in the club books. Because these are adults now. They're not the boys from Horatio Alger, but they're still men who are very good men at heart, but they have a sort of mischievous streak. They're flirting with waitresses, they're competing with each other.
When you're talking about these social clubs, you're talking about men at play.
Yeah.
These are not men at work.
Right.
And in fact, in these stories, most of the time, they're identified only by their club nicknames. Now, that helps protect them, it protects their sort of serious work persona from their men at play, with each other.
Right. Every club
position.
Every club had a jumbo.
The tallest guy.
There was usually a doc.
Almost always, because these were upper middle class folks.
Right. Mm-hmm. Spark is actually a writing handle that I got from one of these.
Yes. And some of these, Outing is one of the more serious of these magazines, but there were a lot of club-centered cycling magazines, such as Bearings from Chicago, that were far more humorous and really had the best of these sorts of club stories and jokes. And the depiction of these friendships was a lot of the inspiration for Sarah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So... definitely look up Horatio Alger if you haven't read him. And if you have, go ahead and give him a reread and just read a little deeper than you may have before, because it's interesting to consider these for the stories they are on a simple level. It's also interesting to consider how they affected the society in which they lived, as people who read these grew up and were thinking about this as a model for themselves.
The myths and the archetypes.
And it's also interesting to think of them in terms of the market in which they were being bought and sold. And so you can always read books on a number of different levels. That's part of what I love about them so much. So, thank you for watching today. We hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a nice thumbs up. And remember to tell your friends about my books. Point at my books.
Yes.
Happy reading!